Let's go to the American capital and speak to Nader Hashemi, who is an associate professor of Middle Eastern politics at Georgetown University. Always a huge pleasure to have you on, Nader. I mean, obviously, we don't have the results yet, but when they come out, what are you going to be looking for in terms of what it might mean for the next few years? Or is, in fact, the turnout going to be even more important than the overall result?
Yeah, very much the latter. But the problem here is that given the nature of the political system in Iran and the nature of the regime, there's no way of knowing with certainty what the election turnout will actually be. Iran does not have an independent election commission, and nor does it allow independent monitors to monitor elections. So whatever figure is announced, I think needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Because those are not the official figures. I suspect the figures are much lower than the official announcement, whatever that announcement will be. And that's not difficult to fathom because these elections are taking place, as was mentioned, against the backdrop of nationwide protests in 2022. And before then, in 2019, there were similar protests. And the level of repression is really at an unprecedented high. Just recently, the United Nations said that the Islamic Republic of Iran executed 834 people last year. That places Iran near the top of the world in terms of the number of state-sanctioned executions. You have a disastrous economy that is a result of American sanctions, but also internal mismanagement. And so when you put that all together, there's not a lot of incentive for people to cast a ballot, given that all the candidates have been effectively screened to ensure a conservative hardline outcome. So I'm not holding my breath that we're going to really learn anything new from these elections, which, I tell my students, they're not really elections. They're more accurately described as selections.
Interesting. Now that you've mentioned some really important issues there, let's pick up on a couple of them. In terms of those who were standing, there were nearly 49,000 applications from people who wanted to stand as MPs. Only 15,200 were approved by the Guardian Council. Do we have any understanding of how many moderate or reformist candidates may have been banned? And how do you get banned from standing? Do you actually have to say or do something specific, or can it be an arbitrary decision?
Well, it's an arbitrary decision, but it's the banning is carefully coordinated with Iran's intelligence services, information ministry, and critically, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to ensure that no candidate that might be independent-minded will be able to run for an election. So there's heavy screening. I mean, some background information here is important. Since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979, elections were never free in terms of allowing anyone to run for office, but they were for the first 30 years fair in the sense that when there was ideological screening for the first 30 years of Iranian elections, there was sometimes a serious choice between more hardline candidates and more reformist candidates. All that came to an end in 2009 when it looked like Iran was going to elect a reformist candidate, a man by the name of Mir Hossein Mousavi, and the country broke out in a major revolt known as the Green Movement. And after that time, elections were heavily circumscribed in terms of making sure that the only people who could run were people who had passed a very high level of ideological screening to ensure their utmost loyalty to the supreme leader and the ruling political system. So that's how the system works. Now you have a system where, the regime suffers a massive crisis of legitimacy. So it's very sensitive to ensure that no candidate can run that has popularity, that is independent-minded. And so all of these 15,000 candidates that you have mentioned are really no-name candidates that people don't really recognize. And the ones that do have some popular recognition are ones that are very loyal to the hardline sort of orientation of the Islamic Republic that comes out of the office of the supreme leader. That's how it works in Iran.
Now that we only have about a minute left, you mentioned repression. Is that repression stopping the rest of the world gaining an understanding of how much may have changed definitively since those 2022 mass protests in terms of the relationship between the general population and the government? Are we not really understanding that as casual observers because of repression? Or does it not actually exist as much as we think?
No, the repression is severe. I mentioned the number of people who were executed. The only way we can find out anything about this elections is if we had independent monitors or perhaps journalists who could report how many people actually showed up at the polls. And most of the major cities, all the reports that I got today, was very low turnout. And that's just a reflection of the general disillusionment and the crisis of legitimacy that the Islamic Republic is facing today in the eyes of its own citizens.
Nader Hashemi, thanks so much indeed.
Thank you.